All right. Well, if you're joining us here today, it's probably, I hope, because you're taking the course with RC and me, the course called Justified by Faith Alone. That is, of course, a course taught by Dr. R.C. Sproul. I'm moderating it. There's about almost 3,500 people taking the course, which we're really excited about. And this is one of the live events that we're having to go along with the course. These are optional events. You can listen in. And really what we want to do here is supplement and complement the material you're hearing from Dr. Sproul. And so last time at the end of our preview week, I answered a bunch of questions that you had submitted and many of you had voted on to identify the most popular questions. And I promised then that we would, this week, at the end of week one, have a special guest. And our guest this week is Dr. Steven Nichols. He is the president of Reformation Bible College, a bunch of other things, chief academic officer for Ligonier Ministries. He's written a bunch of books. To the point, he's written a book called Martin Luther, a guided tour of his life and thought. And he's written another one called The Reformation, How a Monk and a Mallet Changed the World, which should make it obvious why he's here. So, Dr. Nichols, aka Steve, thanks for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Looking forward to this conversation, Tim.
Yeah, likewise. Now, to those who are listening in or watching, I should explain that because of some travel this week, I'm actually pre-recording this. So that's one of the reasons we won't be answering a lot of the questions you submitted. We'll try to answer those as we go. So I've come up with some questions. I've taken some of the early ones that you've submitted, and we are going to focus on those ones. Of course, this week's teaching from Dr. Sproul is one of 2 weeks that deal head-on with Martin Luther. And this week we learned about his background, where he came from, who he was, and then next week we advanced to the 95 Theses, of course, and really kickstarting the Reformation from there. But I've got some questions I want to ask Steve here, and I want to start with this. As we look across church history, we see some pretty unlikely Christian leaders. And maybe we think first of the Apostle Paul, right? Who would have guessed that that man out persecuting the church, doing everything he could to destroy the church, would have this amazing transformative experience and then suddenly become the chief theologian of Christianity. And as we look at Luther in his early life, I think we see some of the same, that there's no way we could have predicted this guy would be the man who would kick off the Reformation, the man who would really be the one who sparked it. And I wonder if I could ask you this, what in Luther's pre-Christian background would have prepared him to be the reformer he turned into? So what was there in his background that God was quietly behind the scenes using that he would eventually put to use in his work of Reformation?
I think in terms of what Luther really contributes, if we really just back up and say, what is it that Martin Luther brings to the table in the history of the Christian tradition? It has to be this. It has to be his laser focus on the doctrine of justification by faith alone. These are the beautiful words of Paul in Romans 5, that having been justified by faith in Christ, we now have peace with God. Mm-hmm. And if I think Luther, we sometimes call him a one-note theologian, and it's justification. Yeah. But this is Luther. So where does this come from? Well, it comes theologically, of course. It comes exegetically with Luther, his study of Romans. But it also comes very existentially with Luther, if I may. So we got to look at the early Luther here. And one of the words that Luther used to describe himself is this German word, Anfechtung, or even better in the plural, Anfechtungen. And this idea, I know I'm really bad at French names. I don't even try to pronounce those, but in the German, at least make a stab at it. So these Anfechtungen are anxieties. They're soul struggles. And this was Luther. While he was a law student, he struggled. He struggled with trying to be pleasing to his dad. In some ways we sort of psychoanalyze Luther, young man Luther, Erik Erikson's book, and perhaps overdoes it. Not perhaps, does overdo it. But there's also a sense in which Luther, there's some truth to that. He was striving to please his father through his law studies, and he was fearful of God as a young man, as a student. Then, of course, comes the thunderstorm, right? The famous thunderstorm, and he makes his vow, "Help me, St. Anne, and I will become a monk." This This was the only saint. This was the only lifeline Luther knew to appeal to. It wasn't within his worldview to say, help me, Christ. Help me, God. He needed a buffer between him and God. And that buffer was the church, and it was represented by all that the church set up. And in this case, it's St. Anne.
Yeah.
So here he is, thinking that God has unleashed the heavens to take out his very soul. And he's clinging to this saint, and he's clinging to some vow. Help me, St. Anne, and I will become a monk. You know, he's dealing with God, right? Save me, and I'll become a monk. Then he gets to the monastery, and it's almost one step forward and two steps back. And so I think what we see in Luther is this struggle, the soul's struggle to be at peace with God. And all around him, the voices are saying, rely on this, the sacraments, rely on the saints, rely on these structures, and you will have peace with God. Luther's not buying any of it because he knows how sinful he is and how holy God is.
Yeah.
But he can't see to a solution. And it's not until he sees what Christ has done for us, and he sees the doctrine of justification by faith, a lightning bolt out of the sky. And now Luther says, aha, right? It's alien righteousness. Yeah. It's not what I produce. So I think everything, Tim, was working to prepare Luther for what we call the breakthrough moment. You can really see how God was orchestrating. And if you were to plug in Luther any time before his conversion, he'd probably tell you most of the time he's miserable.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really kind of tragic story, right? As we hear about Luther in his younger days, he was so unhappy and he was so afraid, and he was so eager to please his father, who really in his own mind was God, I suppose, or took that place of God, the classic fear of man. And he really is this pathetic figure that we feel very deeply for him. And I'm fascinated by the fact that he took law training and then ended up discovering this legal thing, this justification. Yeah. And you wonder how much his law training prepared him then to look at the Bible and to draw out this concept of justification, being declared in a legal sense right with God. So it seems like his legal mind was used by God to mine that doctrine right out of Scripture and make him just very attuned to it.
I think it's true. You can make a similar case for Calvin's education, which he was not, he's supposed to go to study for the priesthood, and that's how he was sort of funded to go to the University of Paris, but he doesn't want anything to do with it. He wants to be a humanist scholar.
Yeah.
But what does he do? He applies all those techniques as a humanist scholar to exegesis, to theology, and, here we are better off for it. And I think the same thing is true in the case of Luther, that again, God is orchestrating all these lines and weaving them together to make the tapestry he wants to make. But if you pull out any one of those threads at the time, they just don't make sense. And you don't see them leading. And I mean, that's true for all of us, right? In terms of how God leads us.
Right. Yeah. Just this morning in family devotions, we were reading David Helm's book on the Westminster Confession of Faith, just little family devotionals. And we were, the passage we read was the life of Joseph, and just pointing right from there that God is doing something behind the scenes. And you look back on it and you just see each little piece. In the moment, none of it really makes sense, or doesn't necessarily make sense. You look back on it from the vantage point of a little bit further on in history, and you just see what God has been up to. And I guess with Luther, and then later with Calvin, and with so many of these other reformers, we see how God took who and what they were even before they were believers, and then worked all that, directed all that to his purposes. So I guess there's comfort there, right? There's comfort that God is always at work. Now, we talked about Luther being this tragic and sad figure. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about 16th century Catholicism then, or even 15th century Catholicism, which Luther grew up in, which really seems equally sad and equally tragic and equally harsh. And I wonder if you can what are 2 or 3 things we need to know about Catholicism in that day, or what was really Christianity as most people understood it in that day, that helps explain where Reformation came from, where Luther came from?
I think 2 things helped me as I tried to understand this whole time period and what then led up to the Reformation. So one of the things that I think is really crucial for us to get is that sin and grace become quantified as we go into the Reformation. So the issue is not that as Luther's going to come to say, I'm a sinner at my root, right? This is a rediscovery of an Augustinian notion. And the Latin word is radix, which isn't radical. It's more like radish, you know,
Right.
and in a radish, you eat the root, right? So the problem is not my sins. Fundamentally, the problem is I'm a sinner at the root. But in this medieval moment we find ourselves, this latter medieval moment, sin has been totally quantified. It's about demerits and sins. So if sin is quantified, now we're going to do the same thing to the other side of the equation. We're going to quantify grace and merits. So what I need to do is cancel out my demerits with my merits. And of course, I can't do that because I'm just, you know, an ordinary person and I'm not capable. So there are these people who have more graces than they need. And actually the technical theological term here is supererogation. Now that's not super irrigation, like a lot of water. It's super-ero, supererogation. And it's from the Latin word for works, like ergonomics, study of work. So these are works above and beyond what I need. And those people are saints. Those works go into a treasury, literally a treasury in heaven. And Luther's going to talk about this in the 95 Theses. He's going to say the church's true treasure is not the merits, but it's the gospel of Jesus Christ. So what we have is this idea of a treasure box in heaven. And now you can appeal to those saints. And of course, at the top of the chain is Mary. And Mary is full of grace, right? We know this from the Mass. So she is the one who has full of grace in terms of a quantity of graces. And this is salvation. We need to have these graces, merits outweigh our demerits. And if we don't get them all handled in this life, don't worry, because then you go into purgatory and that will expunge the rest of the demerits and then you will be ready for heaven. What Luther found, and this is a one step forward, two steps back. Yeah. What Luther found, first of all, was that our problem's not sins. Hey, if it's sins, Luther says, if ever a monk got to heaven by monkery, I was the monk. If the problem's sins, I'm all in. I can do this, and I'll get my way. But that's not the problem. The problem is I'm a sinner at the root, and nothing I can do. Do we realize what the standard here is? It's the holiness of God. Nothing I can do can reach that. So this is when Luther makes his famous, I hate God moment. Yeah. He hates this righteous God who requires me righteous. So what does Luther need to discover? Well, grace is not quantified either. So the first, I'd say the first thing to understand is the way sins and graces were quantified and how the Reformation is a counter to that. The second part is a Latin word that we speak in terms of merit as congruo, congruous merit. And what that means is grace and merit is almost like, we use this expression, infusion as opposed to imputation. So infusion is like a shot, right? So I get a shot of grace. And that, yeah, it comes to me from the cross. Ultimately, all grace comes from the cross. Medieval Catholicism believed that. But the question then is, I work with that grace. I am congruous with that grace. And then I accomplish a righteousness that is pleasing to God. What Luther wants to talk about is imputation. Imputation. You can't have the doctrine of justification by faith alone without affirming the doctrine of imputation. Mike Horton, a few years ago, said it's like chocolate chips and chocolate chip cookies. You can have the dough, you can have the sugar, the flour, make all the ingredients. If you don't put chocolate chips in there, it's not a chocolate chip cookie. And imputation is the chocolate chip. And if you don't have it in there, it's not the gospel. It's that simple.
Yeah. So. You mentioned his famous, sometimes I hate God saying. And I guess as you look back then at the Catholicism of his day, and then you take Luther with his unique, again, his desire to get it right, his desire to be found holy, you could see why he would have to hate that God. And one thing that has always fascinated me about Catholicism, I suppose, and especially in that day, was that God was wrathful and vengeful. He was the angry God. And then you had Mary, who was loving and kind. So no wonder that people were afraid of God and pushing God away, and instead embracing Mary as the one who sort of holds God back. And she's the one who brings the grace. Well, God is the one who brings the wrath. So no wonder he would say, sometimes I hate God. I bet he never felt like he had to say, I hate Mary, right? Because they were almost held up in that way.
You know, you're exactly right on there. And your sense of things is just really astute, because, you know, this is even to help me, St. Anne. You know, these were really the buffers, because God was so inapproachable and so distant and so far off. Even Christ, a very popular image of Christ, and this just gave Luther, you know, chills, fear, was a picture of Christ with the sword coming out of his mouth. This is very typical. And where Luther studied law at Erfurt, there were these statues of Christ. Even where Luther gave his first mass, the slab over which Luther was to bow and genuflect before God had an image of Christ with this sword coming out of his mouth. So here's Luther, you know, scared to death of God to begin with. He's confronted with this visual image, and you know, this again is the 2 steps back. And this leads Luther to say, well, I hate this God who requires of me righteousness. And yes, certainly the saints, they were a buffer in this context.
Yeah. And when we understand, again, Luther's context and the Catholicism of that day, I think we could all say, I would hate that God too, because that was such a misrepresentation of God. And so Luther, as he developed in his theology after he became a believer and he really began to study the Bible, he came to see that that wasn't God, and God was actually someone to love and to embrace, not someone to hate. It's certainly someone to fear still. So it's not that everything was wrong. God is vengeful and wrathful. That is who he is, but not toward his people, not toward those who have had Christ's righteousness imputed to them. And so you could see why Luther could undergo just such a massive transformation.
You know, if we fast forward to the end of his life, as he's literally dying, one of the last texts he appeals to is Psalm 68. And it is, our God is a God of salvation.
Yeah.
That's the full biblical revelation of God that then Luther comes to embrace. And then Luther preaches and proclaims. And that's a world away from his upbringing. And that's a world away from this medieval world that Luther really stepped us out of into this proper biblical understanding of God.
Yeah. In the video, Dr. Sproul mentions Luther going to the Scala Sancta and going up on his hands and knees and trying to earn righteousness that way. And again, we sort of talked about why you would do that, right? There was merit, there was value before God in harming yourself and hurting yourself, and you know, the whole hair shirt mentality and all of that you need to abase yourself so you can be more righteous. But then Dr. Sproul mentioned that he went there recently, said in the 21st century, and saw the exact same thing. So is that still part of Roman Catholic worship, or is that people, how does that shape up?
So they're there. They've been enclosed in a building, and they have the Scala Sancta, the holy stairs, and just what these are, of course, these are the steps leading up to Pontius Pilate, and these were the steps that Jesus was on the night he was betrayed and prior to his crucifixion. And Helen, this is Constantine's mother, was a incredibly Christian woman, and of course Constantine is a dutiful son, and he has endless resources. So he goes and brings all these religious artifacts and whatever back to Rome for his mother. What a great son. And one of the things he brings to Rome are the Sancta, the holy stairs.
Yeah.
So they're relocated to Rome. They're right next to St. John Lateran Church, which was the main church before St. Peter's was built. And St. Peter's was being built when Luther went to Rome. So still St. John Lateran was the main basilica that everybody went to. So right across the street from St. John's Basilica are the stairs, and there's a chapel built around them, and there's steps going up around them, and they ask that if you're not Catholic that you don't go up the stairs. But to this day, there are pilgrims who are on their knees going up and down those stairs seeking penance. And it's it was interesting for me to be there as a church historian and to picture Luther, and he gets to the, his famous moment, he gets to the top of the stairs, and it's, who knows if this is true? Utterly disillusioned with his church. So I've got that in my mind, and I'm thinking about this. But then you look at these people, and you think, here we are, 500 years later, right? And it's still there. It still is a darkness that has its grip on folks. So it was both an interesting moment for me personally to be there, and also a sad moment for me to be there.
Yeah, I've learned a lot about Catholicism by reading books, many of them written by Dr. Sproul. But then I think what was perhaps most helpful for me was traveling to Europe and seeing some of old Catholicism in that way. So what's around here in suburban Toronto, Canada, is very, very different. But when you go there and you go to the grand cathedrals in Germany or in Austria, you see very much the kinds of things that Luther was dealing with. So you see skulls and people venerating the skulls, and you see that kind of worship, and you think, okay, now it makes more sense. If it's just, if it's just a priest in suburban Toronto, it makes it a little hard to understand why he got so worked up. But when you see that, it really brings it home in a whole different way. I've got a couple more questions to ask you before we run out of time here. So we're coming up to the 500th anniversary of Luther's 95 Theses, and what we mark as the beginning of the Reformation. A lot of people will be saying a lot of words about Martin Luther, and it seems inevitable that many of those words will be given to his flaws and his foibles, some of which were foibles and some of which were serious flaws. And we'll hear about some of the ugly words he said and the way he would, his temper would get away from him. And of course, we'll hear about anti-Semitism and things like that. So what do we do with those parts of Luther that today just make us squirm, make us think, I'm happy to be with him on justification, I'm not so happy to be with him on those things? What do we do with someone with deep flaws like that?
I deeply appreciate the question, and I think we need to look at it. It's really true of how we deal with all of our church history figures, but let's just look at Luther for a moment. Actually, let me back up. It's actually what Scripture does, right? So even Scripture presents our biblical heroes with all of their flaws, and there's a good reason for that. For one, we have them. Luther is very true of him. Legs of iron, feet of clay. Yeah. We definitely see his frailty and his humanity coming through. And all that's there is helpful. It reminds us that these heroes, we really need to look beyond them, that they're truly heroes because they point us to the ultimate hero who is the spotless, perfect lamb, and they point us to Christ. And most of these people we look to are so effective because they quickly point beyond themselves to Christ. And Luther is certainly in that category. Yeah. Here's how I help people. One is we have to somehow find a line between giving them a free pass. So it's Luther, so we can give him excuses. No, we can't. If he was wrong, let's call him for it and say Luther was wrong. He did speak hastily. At one point he says, Philip cuts with the precision of a knife, I just swing an axe. And this was Luther. If he saw a problem, he's coming in swinging and let the chips fly, right? Well, that can lead to hurtful things. That can lead to harmful things that are being said. And that's true of Luther. So we can't give him a free pass, but neither, I think, should we dismiss him. I think that would be ill-advised. So what we need to do is find that sort of middle spot where we say, look, he was wrong, and here's how he was wrong, and we're not hiding this. But that does not diminish how God used him. And you know what? If God tarries and there's not a second coming for another 500 years, I bet the church 500 years from now will look back on us and say, well, look at this flaw, and look how they totally got it wrong there, right? So let's be careful to not figure that here in the 21st century we got it all right.
Yeah.
And I think as we put some of those things into context, it might help us.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. And we don't have to lionize all of him, right? As you said, we don't have to make him a complete figure. We honor everything he ever is and was and did and said and all of that. We can still say when it comes to these things, when it comes to what he understood about the character of God, the work of God, he got it. He was just going to the Scripture and drawing it out. Last question, just for those who are interested in learning more about Luther, maybe I'm missing something, but it seems to me like there aren't a lot of full-length biographies on Luther compared to some of the other figures in church history. You've had great biographies on Knox lately and on Calvin lately and going up to Edwards and at Whitefield, all of these people. It seems that with Luther, considering the magnitude of who he was and what he did, we don't have a lot of biographies that are maybe at least outside of academia. So where would people go if they just want to learn about Luther? Is it still Bainton? Is that still the go-to, or is there something else?
No, I really enjoy Bainton. Bainton's book, he just writes with, he gets the ethos of Luther, and that comes through on the page. So here I stand, Roland Bainton is the classic biography, and I think it probably will be for a long time to come. There have been a number of recent books with Luther, but I think there is this tendency now to sort of look at him through the 21st century lens and want to be almost anachronistic is the technical term, but to sort of hold him up to our standards and therefore be very judgmental as we go through. I'm not sure that's the most helpful approach to things. I think in terms of some of the thought of Luther, we're going to see a lot of helpful books coming out. I'm not trying to give a plug here. I'm honestly not. But our Dr. Sproul and I have co-edited a book called The Legacy of Luther that Ref Trust is putting out. And it has biography chapters, and then chapters on the solas, and then chapters on Luther on worship, Luther on preaching, Luther on singing. So what we were trying to do there was sort of capture the life and thought of Luther. One of the things I find really interesting about that book is the essay on the later Luther was written by David Calhoun. And one of the things I find missing is the older Luther. Even the two movies about Luther, the old black and white and the more recent one, they end the story at Augsburg at the end of the 1520s. Luther lives another 16 years.
Right.
And it's interesting what happens to him. I mean, he gets old and he gets frail and his friends die and people betray him. There's a lot going on there. And so we asked David Calhoun, who himself is an aged historian who had numerous bouts with cancer, was there at Covenant Seminary as a longtime church history prof, churchman. We had him write on the later Luther. And it's beautiful. Just so touching the way he presents this phase of Luther's life that we sometimes miss. So I'm hopeful. I think you're right. There is a lack of books. I'm hopeful that with the 500th anniversary, we'll see some really good material coming out that can be helpful to the people of God as they try to get a handle on Luther.
Yeah, that seems inevitable. It's a big milestone. I presume there will be lots of publishers eager to take advantage and lots of good historians, hopefully, who are willing to bring us a life of Luther. But it's a tribute to Bainton that's still the go-to, even though it was written quite some time ago now. It's still well worth reading. It's still the one to go to. So thank you for your time. We are out of time. I appreciate it. And Luther is worth knowing, right?
That's right. My pleasure. To talk to you, Tim, anytime, and to talk to you about Luther, I'll always be for that. So.
Likewise. Thanks.